Hello and welcome everyone to the Intrepid Museum's live virtual programming and our Snakin in Space program. Thank you so much for joining us. We are thrilled that you could tune in today. And I hope you're hungry because today we are going to be talking all about space food. That is right, my friends. We are going to chat about the evolution of food up there in space, from cubes and tubes all the way to things like shrimp cocktail and freshly baked cookies. So my name is Alicia, and I'm an educator at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum in New York City. I'll be your host today. And just a quick reminder that the museum's live streams are free. And if you'd like to help to support us in delivering this fun new content, please do click on the link that you can find in the comments or in the description. Also, feel free to use the chat today to say hello. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Also, let us know if you have ever been to the Intrepid Museum before, or maybe if you plan on visiting us sometime soon. Now, at the museum, our mission is to honor our heroes, educate the public, and inspire our youth. And if you are new to the Intrepid, well, here it is. So we are located in a historic World War II aircraft carrier, the USS Intrepid. It was constructed in 1943, and it is now docked right off of the shoreline of Manhattan on the Hudson River. So maybe you visited before, maybe you're looking forward to visiting us again in person in the future. But either way, if you are in the neighborhood, it is kind of hard to miss. The Intrepid is actually so big that if you were to stand it up on its end, it would be taller than a New York City skyscraper. And it is also so long that you could play 3 games of football on it at the exact same time. Now, the Intrepid served in 3 wars. We were in World War II, the Cold War, and the Vietnam War. It was then retired back in 1974. But then a few years later, in 1982, we became the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum. But sometimes visitors come by and they say, all right, I get why you're a sea museum, and I get why you're an air museum, but why space? Why are you a space museum too? Well, let's recap, right? So we are, of course, a sea museum because we are a naval ship. In fact, this giant artifact on display on the right here might bring that to life just a little bit more for you. This is a propeller. In fact, it is one of the 4 that were on the Intrepid that pushed it through the water. But of course, there's also a few different types of propellers as well, right? So here is another type of propeller. This one is on one of our planes. This is the reason why we are an air museum. The Intrepid carried a number of airplanes just like this. In fact, they could fit up to 100 of them inside at any time. And it also had the ability to launch and land those planes, just like you might do at an airport. So it basically was, as we like to say, a floating airport. And this plane in particular is the Avenger from World War II. Now, later on, we also had a little bit more high-tech planes, things like jet planes, like the Fury here. And those were around later during the Cold War. They moved much, much faster. You notice those don't really have propellers there, but we also even had things like helicopters, which were used to rescue people from the ocean too. So, okay, we are clearly an air museum because we have airplanes and helicopters, right? But we are still not really sure about space. Well, everyone, take a look at this. Does anyone know what this thing is? We are looking at this big, black, kind of almost light bulb shaped thing that says United States on it, and it has a flag. Now, some people say it kind of even looks like an ice cream cone that was kind of like tilted on its side, or even a megaphone that, you might shout into. But this, everyone, is a very, very special vehicle. This is something called a space capsule, and it's the thing that takes astronauts up into space. Now, capsules, they actually ride on the top of a rocket. The rocket, of course, is that thing that goes way up into space. There's lots of fire that shoots out of the bottom, right? But then once they get into space, they separate from the capsule. And so the capsule is then left floating around in outer space. Now, why space, right? Well, in the 1960s, during that Cold War era, NASA, our space program, was part of something called the space race. So we were in a race against the Soviet Union, which today we pretty much call Russia. Now, when you're in a race, though, there's always a finish line, right? And the ultimate finish line was to see which country could get all the way to the moon first. But there were, of course, a number of steps that they had to take before you could get to the moon, right? You don't just roll out of bed and end up on the moon, right? So you have to figure out things like how to launch those big rockets, right? And then once you get up there, how to breathe up there, because there's not really oxygen in space. Also, how do you work and sleep over long periods of time? There's also things like docking with other spacecraft and landing on the moon, of course. How do we do that? And of course, eating. But we're going to get to that in just a second. So these capsules were part of some of those very early steps, what they called the Mercury project, Project Mercury, which was just to see if people could even reach outer space and survive up there for a while, just very short amounts of time. Now, this is a replica of one of those early capsules called the Mercury Aurora 7. And let me know in the chat, take a look at this picture. How many people do you think could fit inside of this capsule? What do you think? Take a close look here. How many people, and imagine this is going to be like a full-size man. How many do you think could fit inside of this capsule? And while you're doing that, I'll also tell you that they decided to name it Project Mercury because, well, first of all, in Roman mythology, Mercury, of course, was the messenger god. So you can imagine kind of like their mailman. He was known for being really, really fast, which is quite fitting because if you know your planets, planet Mercury, which was named after him, is also both our first planet and also the fastest planet to orbit the sun. Believe it or not, it takes 88 days to have 1 year on Mercury, whereas here on Earth, of course, it takes 365 days to go around the sun. So going around the sun, that one big orbit, again, is 1 year, and it only takes Mercury 88 days. So they wanted to be the first and the fastest to get to the moon. So yeah, they thought Mercury sounds like a pretty good name. So back to this Aurora 7, you can probably tell, yes, just by looking at it, it is not very big. Couldn't really fit too many people. In fact, I see Rhinoga in the chat there. Yes, you said it can only hold one astronaut inside of it. So if anyone else out there said one, yes, you would be correct. Now, in 1962, the astronaut who went into space in that Aurora 7 capsule was named Scott Carpenter. And here he is. And next to him there is a picture of the Mercury Atlas rocket, that thing again with all the flames at the bottom that took him up into space. And Scott Carpenter was actually only up in outer space for about 5 hours. He did 3 orbits, again, now going around the Earth this time, before then safely splashing down back into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, they figured that the water there would be kind of a nicer, somewhat softer landing surface than landing, let's say, in a desert somewhere on land, or, it'd be terrible landing on someone's house or something like that. But the water is a nice, sort of softer, larger surface to go. But you have to imagine, of course, if something this big is going to land in the middle of the ocean, NASA still needs to go pick it and him up again, right? You can't just leave your astronaut stranded in the middle of the ocean. So they sent out a helicopter to rescue him. But when they got to the place that he was supposed to be, they couldn't find him. And that's because while he was wrapping up his mission, Scott Carpenter had gotten just a little bit distracted by one of his experiments, and he ended up firing his reentry thrusters 2 seconds too late. And as a result, he ended up splashing down over 200 miles off course. Well, fortunately, eventually they were able to track him down. He was just fine. They picked him up and they flew him to the closest airport that happened to be floating in the water, which just happened to be the Intrepid. And so here he is on board the ship. These are some photos from our collection. There he is surrounded by officers and onlookers on board the Intrepid after being picked up from his capsule in 1962. A very, very momentous occasion. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the reason why we are a space museum. The Intrepid played a very important role in retrieving astronauts and their capsules after they returned from outer space. So, my friends, before we move on, I would like to just see if we have any questions about the space race or about the Intrepid's role in the space race. You can feel free to ask in the chat if you do. While we're doing that, actually, too, I just want to point out one other neat thing in one of these photos. Scott Carpenter, he's over there on the right, walking around on one of our decks, and you can actually see on his feet, he is wearing a pretty sweet pair of cons. So see, even astronauts wear sneakers. They are just like us. All right, so let's see these questions here. How long were the Mercury missions? Great. So yeah, they were actually pretty short. Again, we just wanted to test out the waters, so to speak, I guess. So to see if we could even figure out how to sustain life up there before venturing all the way out to the moon or even further. And the moon, of course, would take about 2 weeks at a time. So this means everything. We had to figure out things like basic bodily functions. No one really knew what microgravity would do to your body. So it was, again, just kind of baby steps here. They just wanted to make them very short, just a few hours at a time. There's actually kind of a funny story, though, that I can tell you about our first American astronaut in space, who we just had a big anniversary for this particular launch the other day. His name was Alan Shepard, and he was the first to do something else as well. His mission was just to go up into space and then come right back down again. So total trip would have been like 15 minutes. But the problem is, once he got into the capsule, he realized he had to go to the bathroom. But again, he figured, all right, this mission's just going to be 15 minutes. He could probably hold it, right? But this was actually now the first time that we had sent an American into space. A lot of press around this. So they had a lot of delays. They really wanted to make sure everything was just right. They had so many of these delays that it turned into hour-long delays. And eventually, he just couldn't hold it anymore. So he called up, NASA from his suit there, and he's like, can I have permission? And then they gave him permission and he peed his pants. So they realized, this is actually something, again, baby steps here. Babies pee their diapers, right? They realized, we need to think about how astronauts are going to be going to the bathroom over the period of weeks to get to the moon. So this eventually led to the invention of effectively space diapers. But of course, they don't call them space diapers now. They call them maximum absorbency garments. It sounded a little bit fancier, but they work pretty much the same way. Great question. All right. Any other questions? How do astronauts get food and supplies while in space? Yeah, so they have to take it with them. These early missions, were very, very short, like I said, so they could plan ahead, just, snacks, small things like that. But today, on the International Space Station, for example, they've got a ton of food that they have resupply missions that take them up there, and they stock up because, when they're staying in space for long periods of time, they're going to need that. So, they get their resupply capsules that are sent up to them, care packages, that sort of thing. So they are able to stock up over longer periods of time. All right. So I mentioned that our earliest space missions had a lot of experiments, right? And again, these were just baby steps. We needed to test everything out to make sure that it was even a good idea in the first place to be going to the moon. And one of those things that they experimented with was, of course, space food, which I know is what you're all here for today. Now, throughout history, just as some backstory here, explorers have always had to deal with the availability of food or lack thereof while they were on very long expeditions. Maybe, they were on a boat or riding on a camel through the desert or something like that, or hiking through the wilderness, or even a capsule in space. But the idea of getting nutrition so that you don't develop something like scurvy, if you were a sailor on a ship way back when, and also having enough food for long periods of time, because those journeys can last a while, but also considering something that doesn't weigh too much to burden you down. This has always been an issue since the dawn of time. Now, very early on, we discovered that food could be edible for longer periods of time if you dried it out. Often people would cut up meat or fish or fruit into long strips. They could dry them out in the sun or, also smoke them. But of course, we still eat things like dried fruits and beef jerky and stuff like that. A little later on, we also just developed the idea of curing. So that's basically rubbing salt on stuff to preserve it. Of course, freezing could also make it last longer, which was something that we still do all the time at home. And of course, canning, which many people started doing when we started quarantine last year. But not all of these storage solutions work super well for space flight, because up there you've got limitations on weight and volume. So if they add a lot of food weight, you also have to compensate and think about how much extra rocket fuel you might need just to get off the ground. So they had to think about all these things, also things like the packaging, what's it like in a microgravity environment when things are, floating around everywhere. And until relatively more recently, also the lack of refrigeration. And that is where the genius of people at NASA came in. So early on in the space program, even before we sent anyone into space for the first time on the Mercury missions, they also were really kind of concerned about the ability to swallow in microgravity, or even being able to digest and absorb the food once you ate it. They didn't know what would happen to your body. If everything's floating around in space, maybe your organs are too. Maybe your body can't move everything through the system like it's supposed to. So they were also really concerned with how to prepare food. So things like how temperatures, right, would affect it, or air pressure, or the lack thereof, right? So even stuff like all of these, subtle vibrations that might be felt in the capsule, they just didn't have any idea what to expect. And of course, they also had to consider the additional weight of all of this food on board these teeny tiny space capsules. Of course, we saw the Aurora 7 only held one person back then. Now, in the earliest days of the space program during Project Mercury, our flights really only lasted, again, just a few minutes to about a day. So they didn't really need too much food to take with them. And often they even started off just by eating here on the ground first before they went into space. So you ate one big meal beforehand. So this photo that we're looking at here is of John Glenn having breakfast on the morning of his first historic Mercury flight, where he became the first American to orbit the Earth. So that means, again, going around it. And this has actually now really become a tradition for the astronauts to have one last big meal on Earth before their mission. Because once those early astronauts would go up, they would do a lot of then food testing on those flights. So simple activities to start off, things just like chewing and drinking and swallowing both solid and liquid foods while they were in microgravity. So the earliest food systems that were used on the Mercury flights were similar to military survival rations, or even what hikers might take on a long trip. They had to provide a lot of nutrition, but in a very, very small container. So John Glenn was America's first man to eat in space. And in this picture, you can actually see on the left side, there is a tube. All right, it's kind of like a toothpaste tube, and there's a straw coming out of it. It's floating right next to him on the left there. So what he was actually eating there on that historic mission was applesauce in a tube. Again, you can see that same tube on the left, and also pureed beef and vegetables from the tube on the right. And now afterwards, he said he did actually find it pretty easy to eat in microgravity, but he also complained that the menu was a little too limited for his taste. Now, everyone, as we go through this history of space food, I do want you to pay attention in particular to the beef and vegetables, okay? So that has historically been a pretty popular meal over the years. So you are going to be able to now track how it progresses as we move through time and how they've been able to reinvent and innovate this beef and vegetables. So make a mental note of that and keep watching for your beef and vegetables. But yeah, so these first Mercury astronauts, they found themselves eating this kind of thick pureed paste that they would either suck through a straw or just simply squeeze into their mouths from a toothpaste-like aluminum tubes, like these you can see here. So in this particular picture, we've got bananas on the left and clam chowder on the right, as well as some dehydrated and compressed bite-sized cubes of food that are in the top right there. Banana puree doesn't sound too bad, but I don't know about clam chowder from a tube. That's a little weird. Also, here are some more to give you an idea of this dehydrated stuff. So on the top right side, on the top there, we've got some bread substitute bites. To me, that they kind of look like croutons, maybe. Also, some cookies and chocolate wafers in cubes, and some apricot bites. And also, the rest of the photo is a number of dehydrated powders that could be reconstituted with water. So think kind of like pudding mix, right? You just kind of add water and mash it up. So on the top row, we've got chicken, cocoa, and grape nuts in dehydrated milk. And then on the bottom, there is actually banana pudding, beef and gravy, and some juices. Now, here is another photo of some dehydrated Mercury foods. We've got some strawberries on the top left, pears on the top right, mushroom soup on the bottom, and wait for it. Here we go, beef and vegetables. So now we have graduated from pureed goo in a tube to now a freeze-dried log in a bag. Delicious. Look at that. Now, this photo shows the mechanism for connecting a water dispenser to the food containers that I just showed you. Each portion of food was individually packaged in these kind of flexible, transparent plastic pouches, and they had a water injection port. So then after the water was injected through this little, spout thing, they would, kind of mash it up there and then, be able to eat it. So if you imagine it was kind of like kneaded, right, to get all the water all mixed up in there and then squeezed out to eat. And this picture kind of reminds me, if you ever had like a push pop or like Go-Gurt before, it's like yogurt in a little tube and you kind of like suck it up out of that. That's basically what it was. But overall, as you can imagine, looking at some of these pictures, yeah, the food wasn't really very appetizing. And they also kept running into problems when they tried to rehydrate the powders. They didn't always work great. They didn't always dissolve completely with that water. But fortunately, the Mercury missions weren't that long anyway, so the food was ultimately less essential for their survival. Now, I mentioned that the Intrepid picked up the Aurora 7 capsule, But that actually wasn't the only one that we picked up. We also picked up this one, something from the Gemini project. So the next series of missions were, of course, the Gemini Missions. These were named after Gemini, the constellation Gemini, the twins. Maybe some of you have a zodiac sign of that, and your birthday will be coming up shortly. Because, of course, this was now the first time that NASA sent 2 astronauts up into space together inside of this capsule. So a good kind of fit there, the Gemini twins, and you got 2 people. So it, as you can see, was a little bit bigger than the Mercury capsule that we just looked at. And on board the Gemini 3 mission, we had these 2 guys on the right. We had Gus Grissom and John Young. So these 2 astronauts went into outer space. They also orbited the Earth 3 times and then splashed down into the Atlantic Ocean. Here is a picture actually of the Intrepid retrieving the Gemini capsule from the ocean in 1965. They landed where they were supposed to land, so we were able to pick them up a little faster. And I love this picture as well because you can see all the sailors lined up along the side of the ship, so excited to pick them up. But some of the later Gemini missions were much longer than just 3 orbits. In fact, they were up to 2 weeks long at a time. So this was when some major advancements in space food were born out of necessity. So NASA actually teamed up with the Whirlpool Corporation, so the company that makes refrigerators and washing machines and stuff, as well as with the Army because they had been making survival rations for years already. And they decided they needed to develop some new food and new packaging. And of course, the first thing to go were those aluminum squeeze tubes, those toothpaste tubes. First off, because they were just gross, but also because the metal of the tubes themselves weighed more than the food inside of them. So they had to go because, as we talked about before, the weight and all of the rocket fuel you have to use to compensate, it just didn't make a lot of sense. So NASA knew that if they weren't packaged properly, food could actually start floating around in microgravity and it could damage equipment or even worse, be inhaled. So they actually also then worked with the Pillsbury Company to develop an edible gelatin layer that went over the foods to reduce crumbling of these dehydrated cubes. So these foods were also then vacuum sealed into individual plastic pouches for easy storage. And what you are looking at here is a variety of these things here. We've got date fruitcake, you've got brownies, apricot cereal, and strawberry cubes. But again, yeah, we are looking at dehydrated cubes covered in gelatin. So yes, does not sound very appetizing. Let me know in the chat if you think you'd want to munch on those. I don't know. And some of the astronauts didn't think so either. So there's actually an infamous story that we like to tell about the Gemini 3 mission in 1965 that we picked up. So again, on board the Gemini 3, there were the 2 astronauts, Gus Grissom and John Young. And one of the experiments that they were tasked with on their 5-hour mission was to sample 2 meal packages. And this is one of them. So it had dehydrated beef pot roast on the left, orange juice in the center, toasted bread cubes, and bacon and egg bites, as well as a wet wipe. All right. So obviously they weren't supposed to eat the wet wipe there. Now, 2 days before the launch, fellow astronaut and practical joker Wally Schirra stopped by Wolfie's restaurant and sandwich shop in Cocoa Beach, Florida. So nearby Cape Kennedy, a popular hangout. He picked up a corned beef sandwich, and right before the launch, he gave it to John Young as a joke. Well, John kept that sandwich, and in fact, he smuggled it up into space with him by hiding it in a pocket in his spacesuit. And once they got into orbit, he pulled out that corned beef sandwich and he took a bite, even offered some to his friend Gus, and they ate the first corned beef sandwich in space. But here is the problem, ladies and gentlemen. If you eat a sandwich here on Earth and you've got crumbs, well, we've got gravity, right? So your crumbs are going to go down. On your lap, on the floor, your dog can clean it up. That's fine. But in space, they are going to float everywhere. And that is exactly what happened. Now, that is very, very dangerous, as you can imagine, because like I said, those crumbs could have gotten lodged in their equipment, or worse, they could have inhaled them. So yes, they quickly realized this was a terrible idea and they put it away. But NASA had heard every word of their conversation. So they got in a lot of trouble, as you can imagine, when they got back home. They didn't lose their jobs, but they did have to publicly apologize to Congress, who was furious with them because they were wasting time and money and weren't eating all of this fancy experimental food that they had sent them up with in the first place. But again, lessons learned. They actually also helped NASA to think a little more about this issue of crumbs and other types of food that they should and shouldn't take up into space with them on those early flights. So now, if an astronaut wants to eat a sandwich in space, they can't use bread. They have to use tortillas instead because those are flat packed and they don't really make crumbs the same way. Now, you are probably wondering, what is this? What are we looking at here? Well, this is actually a tribute to that infamous corned beef sandwich. It is an actual corned beef sandwich memorialized in resin at the Gus Grissom Memorial Museum in Indiana. So Congress may not have thought it was very funny, but they certainly did. This isn't the actual sandwich, but it is sort of in honor of it. So shout out to the Gus Grissom Memorial Museum in Indiana. We love to tell that story too. Now, almost 2 decades later, John Young, floating upside down here on the left, became the first commander of the Space Shuttle. And at that point, the food had progressed quite a bit. So do you know what he ate for lunch in space? Any guesses? At this point, things were a little bit, covered a little bit better. They didn't have the same type of issues with crumbs. So he actually ate corned beef, all properly irradiated and sealed this time. So again, a nice little throwback to his earlier days and hijinks. But back on Gemini, water was actually produced on board as a byproduct of fuel cell operation. And so they could inject it with this little hose that you can see on the right. So this kind of just add water, dehydrated foods system kind of gave them a lot more options. And it really cut down on the weight of having to bring up food that had all the extra water with them already. That's why they dehydrated it. So in this picture, you can get a sense of what it looked like at mealtime. You've got the strawberry cubes that you just kind of popped in your mouth. Also, the beef is now there reconstituted in that bag with water. Still doesn't look too appetizing to me, though. Some of the other food flown on later Gemini missions, though, were things like cinnamon toasted bread cubes, which are, I guess, would imagine it would be like a cinnamon roll, maybe. Chocolate cubes, cream of chicken soup, turkey and gravy, and even shrimp cocktail. As time went on, they made a number of additional changes, mainly because they realized that the food just wasn't as nutritionally balanced as they wanted. And also the food preparation took a lot of time and effort. And sometimes the meals themselves just didn't taste great because the water that they were using from the fuel cells had dissolved gases in it. So not quite the cleanest thing to be eating either. And again, sometimes things just didn't really reconstitute properly either. So I want to pause here and see if we have any other questions. Here's that shrimp cocktail again, by the way. I was mentioning a very popular one there. So let's see, what questions do we have? How do astronauts eat when they are in their spacesuits on spacewalk? So the astronaut suits actually have pouches for water with straws that they can drink from. They've got like in their helmet, they can kind of like get to the side and get it. And even little snack bar things like power bars. So they're, again, in the helmets of the suit, they just sort of lean down into it or lean over to suck it out because, of course, they can't use their hands. They're out in space. They can't lift their visor to hold on to something and put it in their mouth because then they could breathe. So it all has to be reachable inside of their suits, just sort of by leaning or turning in some way. It's really interesting to see them try to eat that, though. Any other questions? Do astronauts get to pick their own food when they go into space? So yeah, starting around the Gemini missions, they could pick their food. They had a standard menu, but they were able to swap things out and pick off of a list of foods a la carte. So, they could go with their own taste there. And in fact, yeah, actually one of the most popular dishes, like I mentioned, is shrimp cocktail because of the cocktail sauce. So when you go into space, you are, again, in microgravity. So the fluids of your body do start to shift around a little bit. And a lot of times they go into your head and into your nasal passages. So if you've ever had that feeling of kind of being congested when you have a cold or something, astronauts actually report feeling that way all the time. And when that happens, of course, you can't really taste flavors as well. Your taste buds sort of get affected by all that fluid shifting around in your head. So astronauts apparently really love spicy foods because they are better able to taste them. And of course, with the cocktail sauce there's all that horseradish in it. So that's that very spicy, tangy kick that they can get from it. So they do really love their shrimp cocktail. Although, again, looking at this package, dehydrated shrimp, I guess, we kind of have similar things like that. And I guess, frozen shrimp sort of is kind of like a weird I don't know. But the horseradish sauce is a huge hit for them for sure. Now, by the time of the Apollo program, everyone, the quality and the variety of food increased even further. In fact, the first manned Apollo mission, so that was Apollo 7, had 96 different food items available. And again, they could kind of pick and choose how they wanted to eat that. Apollo astronauts were also the first to have hot water, which was cleaner this time too, no dissolved gases in the same way, which made rehydrating the foods a lot easier and also really improved the taste because it wasn't just room temperature. You know, hot foods just sort of always taste a little bit better. So these are some of the things that they had for the Apollo missions here. Oh, I'll make this a little bigger so you can see. These are some of the different food varieties they had. Again, there were 96 total, but here's just like a little smattering. Again, similar packaging here, but more variety for sure. And some of the earlier packages were just those early plastic tube pouches that they would eat out of. But eventually, a number of foods were changed to this new spoon bowl package. So on the left, we've got chicken and rice that actually flew on Apollo 11. And you can see it is now in a plastic container that would be hydrated through a valve on one side and then opened with a zip top on the top. And then, you know, it's basically like you're eating out of a zip top bag there. But now it's kind of like a bowl. You could eat out of the top with a spoon. So that is your spoon bowl package. On the right, you've also got the same idea. This one is labeled as spiced fruit cereal, and it's also got dehydrated milk powder in with it. So if I had to guess what we're eating here, I'd basically say, yeah, this is like Apple Jacks with milk for breakfast. That doesn't sound too bad. I would eat that out of a zip top bag. And then, of course, we can see our Apollo progression with none other than beef and vegetables. So again, still a dehydrated log at first, but now they can add hot water. And then once they've done that, there it is. They can eat it with a spoon instead of slurping it out of a straw. So delicious. But yeah, there's your progression of beef and vegetables now during the Apollo era. And incidentally, in case you were wondering, the first NASA meal eaten on the moon consisted of bacon bars, peaches, sugar cookie cubes, coffee, and a pineapple grapefruit drink. Sparing no expense for a fancy meal on the moon. Now, some of the other foods consumed on Apollo were coffee, cheese crackers, sausage patties, scrambled eggs, peanut cubes, tuna salad, spaghetti and meat sauce, beef pot roast. So we've got some pictures here of some of those things, but also even hot dogs, all sealed up and irradiated to protect them from growing bacteria. So they started doing this kind of irradiated process in order to protect the meats and to pre-cook things so that, again, they could just add some heat and kind of keep it going that way. So with the later shuttle missions and largely through today, the food does look a little bit more normal. Here are a few of the different types. We still have rehydratable foods, so freeze-dried, and again, all of the water has been removed. These are things like soups and scrambled eggs. But we also have things called intermediate moisture foods now. So these are things that have some water in it. So dried fruits like apricots, just all sorts of dried fruits like that. And then also natural form foods. So these are things that have a really long shelf life. So things like nuts and candies and condiments, things you might, just pull out of your own kitchen cabinets there that you don't really have to add water to. They also had thermostabilized food. So again, this is the stuff in the silver pouches there. So things that have been exposed to heat to kill the bacteria, things like canned foods and pudding cups, stuff like that. But everyone, I know that, we've covered a lot of food here so far, but really, I know you all are probably just dying to know about one particular type of space food. And you're saying, oh, where is the astronaut ice cream, right? So astronaut ice cream, of course, is this very kind of kitschy, like novelty thing that you always get from the gift shop at science museums. I think we actually even sell it at our gift shop in the Intrepid. So you're wondering, what's up with astronaut ice cream? So it is this wacko idea of food in space that has become such just this legendary thing. Everyone loves to get it. It's so weird if you've ever had it. Let me know in the chat if you've ever tried astronaut ice cream before. It's just so chalky and strange and weird to eat. Well, everyone, I have a terrible secret to tell you. Believe it or not, Astronaut Ice Cream and an ice cream sandwiches, actually, which I have one here, they never went into space. And the main reason is that they just didn't like it. But also, if you've ever actually seen that stuff or ever tasted it, I see your 5-year-old loves it, the living Ted. I love it, actually. It's very strange. But, if you've ever seen it, if you've ever opened it out of the package, I don't think anyone has ever opened it and it's all been in one piece before. Those things are just obliterated in the packages, right? They are messy. It's this crumbly stuff. It's not the best. If you remember with the corned beef sandwich story, that would be a disaster in microgravity, right? All of those chalky crumbs from the ice cream. Now, freeze-dried ice cream cubes were originally developed for early Apollo missions by Whirlpool, but they never made it on board. There was one press release about the Apollo 7 mission that listed vanilla ice cream as a dessert on board the ship. But Walt Cunningham, who was the sole surviving astronaut from that mission at the time, he confirmed numerous times that ice cream was never actually on the menu. But I will say, in 2006, there was a freezer that was flown aboard the space shuttle in order to store research samples while they were going up there. So they decided, okay, because it's going to be having samples in it later and because it's empty right now, we'll send them up with the real thing. So they ended up having those little individually portioned ice cream cups in space for the first time. And that was our first ice cream in space. But yeah, this stuff never actually made it, unfortunately. But it is really fun to eat, and I highly recommend grabbing some and trying it out if you haven't, because it's quite an experience in its own. I think that is oftentimes people's first really good memory of going to a science museum is trying astronaut ice cream. All right, so everyone, I want to thank you so much for tuning in for Snacking in Space today. Hopefully you learned a couple cool things. I do want to see if we have any final questions before we round out the program today, though. Any last questions? Why did NASA break up the plan to get to the moon into missions? So again, baby steps. They just wanted to take it slowly. They wanted to first make sure everyone could go into space safely, just breathing, just basic stuff. If we look at this in terms of the life progression of a human, you could say that the Mercury missions were like babies. So again, figuring out how to wear diapers to go to the bathroom, basic stuff. Gemini now, maybe you're a toddler, you're making friends, there's 2 people up there, you're now walking around a little bit. So this was the first time we had our spacewalks. You are, again, making friends by docking with other spacecraft now. So you're moving around a little bit more. And then Apollo, we like to say, is kind of the headstrong teenager phase where, maybe you've got the car and you're going on a road trip all the way out to the moon. So they broke it up, though, again, just to kind of scaffold on itself, just to sort of build on one another in order to make sure that everything was going to be safe. Because, again, you don't just roll out of bed and poof, end up on the moon, as cool as that would be. Maybe someday we'll get there, but certainly not in the 1960s. Any other questions? Can they make their own food in space now? So actually, yes. They have successfully grown a number of vegetables in space. And this has been a long time thing, actually, that they've been studying the effects of microgravity and solar radiation on growing plants and vegetables and things. Because, of course, NASA eventually wants to send people up to Mars eventually. And that's going to be really important. This idea of like hydroponic planting. So that's when you take a plant and you put it in some nutrient-dense water. So without soil, because of course Martian soil is a lot different than what we have here on Earth, we think. And so the plants can grow in this water, even in outer space. So far, we have grown things like lettuce and tomatoes and potatoes. So yeah, I mean, if you're into salads, you are good to go right now. But most of it is brought up. And I will add, though, it has actually, as recently as I believe January earlier this year, it was the first time that they baked cookies in space too. So the DoubleTree Hotel sponsored this experiment. They're the ones that, always have like the warm cookies on your pillow. They sponsored this experiment where they sent up chocolate chip cookie dough, their special cookie dough, as well as a 0G oven that was designed to work in space. But what's really interesting about that is that they had to experiment on bake times for the cookies. They told them, I think when they sent them up, they told them like 20 minutes, like normal cookies you'd have here on Earth. But they wound up finding out that they were very, very underbaked. They were practically not baked at all for the 20 minutes. So they had to experiment a little bit with the 0G oven. Also, the cookies were like weighted down in these packages because otherwise you can imagine the dough would be floating around on the inside of the oven. But ultimately, it took them 2 hours to bake these cookies. And once they were able to figure out the sweet spot of that 2 hours, they said they were great. A little weird and mushy in the packages, but 2 hours. So 20 minutes to 2 hours. So either that oven was calibrated a little bit off, or maybe microgravity does something to the way things heat up and bake and the way that the heat circulates. I don't know. So they're going to have to keep testing that out a little bit more. So I see the Living Ted, you're saying they're talking about a space hotel by 2027 that would have some sort of gravity. I've heard about this. Yeah. Do you think that they would serve real or astronaut food? That's a great question. So I don't know much about what this space hotel would look like. I would imagine to stay at a space hotel in 2027, which is only 6 years away, I would imagine you'd have to be very wealthy in order to be able to afford to do that. I know that they have citizen seats on space missions now where you can buy a ticket. A couple people have done that. Very expensive again, but it's a once in a lifetime opportunity, right? So who wouldn't if you could afford it? But if people are spending that much money, I don't know. Like, would it be part of the experience to eat this strange, dehydrated food, or do you think they would have this sort of like the International Space Station, like resupply missions where they could send up filet mignon and lobster or something like that up into space? They're still experimenting. There is an entire department at NASA that's people's jobs to just experiment with food and to just taste the food and all of these different things around food specifically. So I would imagine that this space hotel would certainly have to talk to them and see what they could do. But I would also say if they started serving fancy foods at the space hotel, I think some of the astronauts would also be like, get us in on that. Why aren't we eating this stuff on the International Space Station? Because effectively, the ISS is a hotel for the astronauts. Although maybe it's more like, a hostel. It's a little bit cheaper hotel for them. It's paid for by the government, but still. So yeah, good question though. I'm curious to hear more about the space hotel. There's been a few, things on the news about that. I'm very curious to see how that progresses. Great question though. All right, my friends. So if you have any other questions about our programs, feel free to reach out to us through our website, intrepidmuseum.org, or also through social media. And again, I would like to thank you all so much for watching and sharing your questions and comments today. Do be sure to follow or subscribe to this channel that you're watching now and visit our website for our upcoming programs. Our next family program is going to be Tuesday at 3 o'clock, High Flying Design, where we are going to talk a bunch about planes on an aircraft carrier. Planes on an aircraft carrier and how they are able to fly. So things like the forces of flight and taking a look at some of the really cool planes that we have at the ship. Also, just as a very exciting reminder, our museum has reopened to the public, so we would love for you to come by and visit us. We are open Thursdays through Sundays from 10 to 5 p.m. right now. So if you're in the area, please do come and check out some of the cool things that we've got on display. We'd love to have you. All right. So once again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. And hopefully we will see you on the internet for an upcoming program. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.